You're out of order.
Public comment.
Places out of order.
Public comment, seeing nobody from the public is here. Going past public comment, so we'll go to the presentation on the wastewater treatment plant improvements by City Manager Stewart and Todd Sneethan from Hubble, Roth and Clark.
All right.
For full disclosure, no relation.
All right, so we are gonna dig right in. I know you guys, I appreciate you taking the time out of your normal busy evenings. And the goal here is to really give you enough time to process a very large document and us walk you through it and talk to you about kind of what we have ahead and how we came to this conclusion. And also have time to gather any questions that maybe you need more information on so that we can provide those. So just kind of why we are here, we have a workshop coming up, or we have a workshop now, we have a vote coming up on next Monday's meeting where we have a public hearing and the potential of an adoption of the plan by City Council. So the reason that we wanted to have the workshop is we do workshops when they're complicated decisions, and that we have a goal of really making sure you have enough information so you feel educated on that decision and enough to move forward. But then we also have this public hearing, and the goal is to adopt the project plan on the 16th, but we have to adopt it by May 30th if you needed a special meeting and to ensure that we keep our place in line as far as getting funding moving forward. All right there.
Keep going.
Okay. So this kind of gives a breakdown of public hearing, adoption of the plan, full design plan begins, and then amendments to the plan and data on inflow by late summer, and then with a goal of bidding next year to then start forward with. So just as a big background to remind us how we got here. So majority of the plant, all of you know, is fairly old and at its end of useful life. But really the big highlight was in 2011 when we were under administrative consent order that really outlined the improvements we needed to make. But the biggest part was including that we no longer were bypassing up to the standards of a 25-year, 24-hour storm. That's really important because that's really the threshold for majority of the requirements of the improvements. While the plant is past its useful life as far as processes and the actual structures, which we'll talk about, what's really driving the urgency is this administrative consent order, as well as the safety of the plant. So since that consent order, we did some plant improvements, which is the new entrance works. We did a feasibility study to determine whether we could upgrade the plant on the current structure or on the current footprint, which is where we really were driven that we needed to move the DPW facility. And that feasibility study recommended us looking further into a solids handling study that wasn't addressed in that feasibility study, which we have completed, and that has some recommendations. And also, as we move forward with the design of the plant, refining the equalization if there was needed. And so those were things that still needed to be addressed that were after the feasibility study. So we are at the design. You guys awarded the design work in February, and they had a very aggressive timeline in order to get us to an application, really, which is what the project plan is, to the state for loan financing for the project for the following year. So just as a reminder on the feasibility study. So when we went through that feasibility study, these were some of the assumptions that we had. Really, we were working under the data that we had, which was limited, but it gave us some information on flows, what a 25-hour, 24 event would look like, and it made some recommendations. As I mentioned already, it recommended that we do some more research on solid handling, but we always thought we could do that maybe as a phase, as a later phase. So it was in the CIP in a later year as far as the actual implementation, but you're going to see some changes to that recommendation today. We also talked about the plant being undersized and needed to be improved. It does reference reducing infiltration and inflow, considerations of equalization, and then also upgrading the plant. You guys may be familiar when you went through the feasibility study of this chart. I know you can't read it here, but this is the one that we've been referring to a lot of, kind of how they were ranked, what the operational costs were, and all of those things. So this has kind of been the thing that we've been leaning on when it came to CIP. So as I mentioned, we had this history going into it. And then we hired a consultant in February to move forward with the actual design. But part of that process was to apply for the state and present a project plan that had to provide more details and modeling of that we were going to be able to meet the requirements of the consent order through the construction of this project. In order to get permitted, you have to show that you're demonstrating that. And so that's where we refined a lot of the data and we refined some of the project plans. So I'm going to turn it over to Todd to kind of talk through that. And I can share, do you want to? Okay.
All right, I'm Todd Sneeden, Vice President of Roth and Clark. We're an engineering consulting firm that's all over the state of Michigan. We have an office in Delhi Township, which is one of the ones I'm responsible for. So as Deb was indicating, as part of the process that we went through, one of the big things was applying for this to complete a project plan. This project plan gets you in line to get additional money from the state. Low interest loans is what it is. And by doing that, you have to put this plan in place that the department, which is called EGLE now, it used to be called DEQ, which they have to review and make sure that you meet the standard requirements that are in there. This page is the assumptions. The first two assumptions are very similar to what was assumed when you did the feasibility study. The big issue though is that we updated the estimate for what the storm was that you had to store and be able to treat. And as opposed to being, I think it was at a 7 million gallons of MGD, we now found, based on the headworks work that you guys have done, you have much better records for how much flow goes through your plant, how much you're able to treat. But it's at 13 million gallons is how much flow. I mean, you can, you almost double the amount of water that's going through your plant. So because of that, that's what one of the requirements is for meeting your ACO that's currently have signed. So the recommendations we made was one being that originally it was talked about doing one type of treatment at the plant. We recommend doing a little bit different type of treatment. We can talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We talked about adding equalization. You have to store some of your flow on site because you can't treat it and you can't discharge it directly to the river. That's about 2 million gallons of storage. There was storage before, but it was a pretty minimal amount and it was thought to be able to be contained within your current facility that was there. You were going to use some tanks that you weren't going to use as part of the next project. And then, as the city manager indicated, doing the solids handling project. This is something, and we'll talk in more detail about every single one of these. So, but those are kind of the big, ones. And then the inflow and infiltration, or I&I, which is part of why you guys have to be able to store this volume. So that's another piece that, I think we continue to think that maybe we'll get a better understanding of, and by doing that, we can potentially reduce the size of your equalization tank and make it smaller so you don't have to store as much flow at that point. All right. So I'll go through this just briefly, but so we talk about this 25-year, 24-hour storm. It equals about 3.9 inches. So you have to create this graph, and this is a graph that EGLE looks at in order to determine what amount of storage you have to have. And you can see based on all the information we currently have that you're at about the 13 million peak flow. There's this dark line on there, which is 6 MGD. It's a straight line that runs across there. And that is what what the plan would be in terms of the capacity that you'd have at your plant. So what we have to be able to do is be able to treat and or capture and then treat this area underneath this blue line between the dark line and that little peak there. That's the area that we have to be able to treat. So I don't, unless there's questions, I won't go into any more detail about that. So the other thing when talking about refinement, refining from the feasibility study that was done, kind of trying to refine better what we actually have. So as part of the feasibility study, activated sludge was really in primary clarifiers was the recommended option at that point. Oxidation ditch was on there. It was close second for third. And from our perspective, based on the amount of flow you guys have, based on the size of your facility, and I think a big thing too is cost. We are recommending that you go to an oxidation ditch. It's less costly by potentially about $2 million, maybe even a little bit more than that. It's easier for the operators to maintain and operate. And the reason why that is there's less equipment that has to be utilized with regard to that. And for the size of your facility, it really is a very good technology for the size of plant that you have. We've worked with a number of different similar municipalities, City of Sheboygan, Howell, that have the same type of technology. And it works very well for a plant of your size. One of the things I know that was looked at the feasibility study, which was a concern, was that you had, if future industry were to come to you, were to want to come into the city of Mason, would you have the flexibility? The activated sludge provides somewhat almost unlimited flexibility. This is significantly less, but there are some things that you can do. And there is what's called pre-treatment. It's treatment that can be done before any water ever gets to the plant. So it doesn't preclude you from developing. It doesn't preclude you from any of those things. It just means that you're going to have to look at it a little bit closer. And there may be some things that we can do. I think the one other issue, the negative issue on the activated sludge side of things, is the odor issue. Currently where the facility is located, activated sludge without having an odor control system, which was not included in the project, you would get significant complaints. The oxidation ditch has an odor, but it's an earth odor. You don't even notice that it's, you don't even really notice it. You would notice an activated sludge system if you did not have an odor control system. So those are kind of the pros and cons we went through about trying to make a decision and why we switched from one possibility since the feasibility study to another, the other option.
And I would just mention that our staff spent a lot of time talking with the consultants and understanding, and actually they've looked at other plants and they're comfortable with this change. So that was important too.
With more flexibility, I was thinking of this too, when we got the packet and we said, it's not what we thought, we'll have to go bigger. For flexibility, you know, the future being vertical hydroponic farming. This really helps with that, because I know that is the future. So then this wastewater treatment plant could, in theory, help take care of that, or potential marijuana grow industry also.
The issue that you will run into with this type of facility with the oxidation ditch, you still have additional water that can flow through the plant. It's when you get a high strength industrial waste, that's when you start to run into problems. But most facilities that would be, like Wyeth was a perfect example. They did what's called pre-treatment right on their site before they discharged anything to the city. So that would be one of the options that you could do. And that's pretty common for an industry.
Thank you.
So wanted to kind of show you, as Deb had mentioned, this is a challenging site. And I know you guys have had lots of conversations about the challenges associated with the site. You have it looks like a large site, but part of the problem is that the vast majority of the site's in the floodplain, which means that you really have you can do some construction in it, but you're very limited. And then you also run into having to get some pretty significant permits, and sometimes they don't allow what you want to do. So there's this dark black line that's kind of 2/3 that kind of runs kind of not quite diagonal, but almost vertical through the site. On the left side of that is is an area that's not in the floodplain, which there's really no issues with. Everything to the right is within the floodplain. So what we thought was a good idea to do this is we can take advantage of some of the some of the structures that are out there right now and rebuild in those locations and not have an issue with a floodplain permit. So we're really not proposing to do anything of any significance in the floodplain, which we feel that that's a huge piece of this, because sometimes floodplain permits can take a year to 2 years to get, but we can utilize your existing footprint in order to do that, utilize some of the existing tankage that you have and some of the structures in order to be able to make this work. I guess the big thing is this, there's a big circle on the right-hand side. That's your equalization tank that we're proposing. What's currently there right now is some of your storage tanks that are over there. So even though that's in the floodplain, you already have something there. The Eagle and Corps of Engineers will allow you to build there. So this is a cost summary for constructing a plant with an oxidation ditch. So we're currently, for a construction project, at the cost of basically $27.9 million. Significantly higher than what you had before. But I think there's some things, there's some reasons why it's higher, and then there's also some other funding that's associated with it that can help reduce the cost. And as the city manager indicated, one of those things was that there was talk about the oxidation ditch, but there was not really much cost in there associated with that. And that's a significant piece of this. Plus the solids handling was never part of the original project. That was something that was thought that could be done later, but due to the way the plant, the conditioning plant and what's being proposed, really now is the time to do it in order to make everything work. Let's talk, I'll try to be brief about the equalization basin. I think I talked a little bit about what that is. So what would happen is any flow above what you can treat through your plant we would put a pump station in and pump it to this tank. And then it would sit in this tank until it reaches the point where your plant can actually treat it. And then it get pumped back to the front of the plant. That's how equalization works. So what the issue is your administrative consent order says that you have to be able to treat, you cannot discharge anything below the 25-year, 24-hour storm. And so based on what we calculated, that would be this 13 million gallons a day. We can do that with a 2 million gallon tank, even though you have a 6 million gallon plant, 6 million MGD plant and a 2 million gallon tank. There's some hydraulics that are there. You can put more water through your plant on a regular basis when you're having a storm event. So you should be able to, this 13 million should adequately cover anything that you do. And our hope is we're currently doing some additional work right now, doing some monitoring to try to get that number even smaller. Our hope is we can get it down even lower, but until we have some more meter data showing what your inflow and infiltration is in your system, we won't be able to really back that down. But we've got, our hope is over the summer months before we start design, we have the ability to reduce that volume to save some additional costs.
I think what's important here is equalization is becoming a thing for a lot of communities, right? Because these are 1 or 2 year events and you don't want to necessarily be managing your plant at that size all the time. And so this is an offset. It's an expensive addition. But I also want to make clear that adding the equalization does not necessarily mean we will never bypass. It means we will be meeting the minimum requirements to make that allowable, but you may still bypass. So we have to build a plant that meets the requirements of the 25, 24-hour rain event. But if you look at some of these rain events, like the one in 2011, we wouldn't have meet that. I mean, it's over the 3.9. There's potential that would have been a bypass event. It's going to be much more rare, but I want to make it clear that this doesn't mean never ever, you know.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, it will not be a violation of your permit, which currently it would be a violation. So your permit will be written that you will, if you can build a plant to be able to contain and treat this size storm, if the flow is beyond that, then they will say, we understand you have to fill out a report and say that you did it, but there's no repercussions. they understand that there's not unlimited funds to do this. They set some standards and they want you to build the X. And, you know, as people are aware, sometimes with the rain events that we're getting recently, sometimes that is not, you're not able to contain those. So. Then the other piece of this is the addition of the solids handling, which was not included as part of this project in the feasibility study. So currently, the system has reached its life. You do land application of liquid sludge onto the farm fields. One of the problems that's happening with that is the reliability of being able to do that. It's still an option, but it's becoming more and more difficult. You have a smaller and smaller window of being able to apply this because you have to have very good conditions on the fields that you're applying. And that can be, and they have to be dry, which the time you apply is in the spring and in the fall. And as everybody knows, you know, the spring and the fall, not too many fields are dry. So that really kind of sometimes creates some unreliability in being able to put this on the fields. So we had done a study for you to supplement the Prime Neloff study, and we had recommended a different option for the solids handling. And what that would be is that we would dewater the sludge, and then we would put it into a dumpster, and then it would be taken to the landfill and disposed of that way. That's called dewatering the landfill. It's a more consistent, more reliable option. A lot of communities are doing that now. And it just takes away this unknown of the land application that is becoming more and more difficult to be able to do. So, and the costs overall are really very similar to each other. It's not like one is significantly more than the other. They're very close to each other. I think what you guys will be getting is a reliability, and plus, just based on the way your plant's laid out, this will provide, I think this will provide you a better project to be able to utilize the limited space you have. So.
Okay, so I know what you're most concerned about is what does this mean financially? What does this mean for our users? What does this mean for how can we afford this? And I'm sure when you saw that number of the cost, you had a similar reaction that I did, which was, oh my gosh, how are we going to be able to afford this? And how is this feasible? And can we actually move forward with this project? So I wanted to walk you through kind of the cost estimates, how we got to where we are, what we put in the public hearing, and what we've refined since the public hearing has been announced. So the feasibility study cost estimates, just as a reminder, at that time in 2018, we were looking at 13 million for the plant overall. This didn't include a lot of, well, it didn't include obviously the cost increase or things like that we're seeing, but it also didn't include the solids handling or the equalization. And so the solids handling, we did a study in 2021, which estimated the cost of that between $2.3 to $2.9 million without general conditions, engineering, or contingencies. That was just the cost of constructing. And so we had a little bit better idea on cost, and we also figured out with the design process that we really can't pace that in. That's one of those things where we actually need to use certain spots, and we need to address this issue at the same time. When you're doing this kind of scale, you don't want to delay that portion, and that's something really critical. So when we get to the cost estimates at the public hearing, and the reason I say this is because we did do a public hearing announcement because that's required for the plan. But since that, we've actually refined it further, but we want to walk through what we actually announced in the public hearing so that you will see kind of the breakdown of how we got to the number. So the overall plant was 19.8, which is a 34% increase, mainly due to inflation. That's the actual cost of the plant. We had added the solids handling, which is 3.2 once we added in the general conditions, engineering, and contingency. We added the equalization tank, which is another $5 million, and that's going to be required to meet the administrative consent order. If we don't do the equalization tank, we don't need the order. Total project cost, $28 million. If we reduce that by the SWACN federal contribution, 3.5, and then the LDFA contribution of 2.8, that got us to 21.7. We had done a notice of intent, I think in January, capping it at 20 million of our request to the state because we thought 20 million was a good guess. And we weren't exactly there. And so we put in the public hearing though a cap of 20 million, thinking what can we phase, what can we do? And that would have resulted in an annual debt payment of 1.2 million with an estimated cost to a residential user of $27.62. So $27.62 every month. So that was the public hearing announcement. What we've done since then is refine those costs. So again, similar on the upfront on the cost, 19.8, 3.2, 5, getting a total project cost of 28 million, reducing by the federal contribution, reducing by the LDFA contribution, gets us to 21.7. That is more than what we put in the public hearing as far as total cost, but that's what we need to actually get the project on. That updates the debt payment to 1.3 million. What we didn't include in the public hearing was that we plan to put an LDFA annual contribution of at least 500,000 each year. And so that will reduce the cost to the residential user significantly. So now the estimated cost to a residential user average is $18.54, which is much more reasonable in my mind. Still a lot, but it's reasonable. I will say the LDFA contribution is a conservative estimate. Right now, we could contribute 600,000 annually, but we know how TIF districts work and sometimes property taxes fluctuate. And so we wanted to be conservative on the 500,000. Of course, we would put everything we could towards the payment that was available, but we want to be conservative as we're giving you these estimates.
So that 1854 estimated cost for the residential user, is that on top of what we're already charging?
Yes. This will just be for the debt of this project.
That doesn't
So-
include any water hikes.
This does not, this is just debt related to this. Right now, our,
So we just went to 7064, right? Is that what we, wasn't that what we just approved?
if I go to this gives you the average user right here with the July bills. So what you just approved as far as increasing starting July, this is our average user. 1 unit, 4 unit, and an 8 unit. And so this would be the charge for residential units in addition to what they're paying for their usage. And just to be clear, what we're estimating here is not a usage structure. We're estimating based across the board on meters equivalent. So that means all the residents would be charged the same versus commercial would be charged higher because of a meter. That would all be something we'd have to work through on the rate study. But I wanted to give you some at least numbers so you get an idea of what we're talking about. So depending on the user, obviously a low unit user, 1854 is a huge, it's almost double what they're paying now because they're only paying 19. But for a 4 unit user, which is our average user, it's about 26% increase. And this is just for the debt related to this plant. This doesn't include anything else. This is just the additional cost related to this debt.
Well, just to be clear, there isn't anything else right now that we
No.
know of. I mean, right now, that
No.
1929 is what a current user actually pays today, or
Yes.
as of July 1st. And then the only other thing we know of to add right now is the 1850.
Correct. So this gives you an idea on the commercial users based on their meters of what the percentage increase would be. And I want to be clear, these are all rate things that you will decide before are finalized. These are just estimates so that you can see the impact of what this may look like. You could do a user rate structure. You could do a meter equivalent structure. You could do a ready to serve just for debt based on rate structure. All of those things are possible that we will be recommending to you through the rate study process, and you would be making a final decision. I will say we're really nervous about a usage driven coverage of this cost, because if usage goes down, we may not meet the payments for the loan. And so knowing that there is a flat, that this is the revenue we know we're getting from users is something that we definitely want to take into consideration as we go through that evaluation.
Well, we experienced that through COVID.
Exactly.
So we're very aware So,
So if we would have done a loan based on the usage prior, we would have struggled to make the payment when it came to actually, if we didn't have some type of debt. I call it a ready to serve, but it's just really a debt kind of structure that would be based on the meters that you know what revenue you need to get in and it's broken out between users. So I want to emphasize two things. One is that I know it's a lot more expensive than we expected. A lot more expensive than we expected.
could we, just so I understand, so if it's roughly $20 now, and then it's going to be $20 for the debt part, we are talking about water-based definitely.
If you look for a low user, that is what you're talking about. If you're talking about a 1-unit user, our average user is a 4-unit user. And so for them, the 1854 is an increase. I mean, these are all increases. I'm not saying that they're not. But I do think you have to look in context of the amount of money and as well as the type of user you have. And we are unusual not having a ready to serve because the reality is whether you're a low user or a high user, we have to provide a system to serve you. That's the reality. Whether you use a lot of water or the next person uses a lot of water in that home, it's no different to us. We still have to provide that facility. And so I think that'll be a lot of the discussion during the rate discussion. I want to be clear, we're going to talk about recommended actions. We're going to be pushing to get that rate study complete by the end of summer, beginning of fall. There won't actually be a rate increase related to this debt until 2023, because that's the soonest you would be doing it. But that doesn't mean we can't finalize how we're going to structure that early and make sure you guys have enough time to figure that out.
Those numbers include the 12, are they based on today or?
No,
with the
they're based on
12%
July.
increase?
They're based on July numbers.
With the 12% increase?
Correct. So I want to just kind of lay out timeline for decision. So the workshop today is meant to inform you and just kind of give you the high level preview of what's going on. We have a public hearing at the next meeting. We're going to be asking council to adopt the project plan. And we have the ability to make amendments to that plan until the end of late summer. And in that same time period, we're going to be requesting, well, we're going to be asking you to do some more diligent work on I&I and some other things that we can try to tackle to get the equalization smaller if we can identify, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. But the key thing here is we cannot lose our place in line. Because if we wait another year, let's say you said, you know, I just want to kick this down the road. And so we'll get back into this process the following year, and then it'll be a whole nother year and we will be outside of our consent order as far as completing the construction. So we are going to have to go no matter what to do negotiate an extension to our consent order. It is going to be, I think, difficult and unlikely if we don't have a plan for construction. So why we can't wait? Kind of already gave a preview of that. I don't want to negate the fact that the plant today is a safety issue. I mean, I have been there when we have had contractors say they won't be near certain parts of our facility because they don't think they're safe. Our staff avoids certain parts of our facility that they don't believe are safe. It's a real issue. We are at the end of a lifespan of a plant, and I've heard the stories many times how we were going to improve it however many years ago, and that didn't happen. And the plant still, they've been piecing it together. But it is, if you go out there, you're seeing parts of the plant fall apart. Second issue is safety for the community. You know, we've talked to our city engineer, we've talked to others. I mean, there is a concern that the facility will have a significant failure within the next 5 years. And that is not a situation that any of you want to be in. I know staff does not want to be in, and we don't want it, we're pushing it as we go. State regulations. We can argue and debate whether Eagle we should be under consent order or not, or any of those things, but the reality is that regulations in Eagle have changed since 2011. There's not going to be a lot of flexibility with communities that are not moving forward. They're expecting, and I can tell you, I know of at least 4 or 5 in this region that are in the same position and they're about to build a plant. And so there's not a lot of understanding of, oh, it's financial constraints. Oh, we don't want to charge our users more. That's not an argument that Eagle cares about. And we have to be it's one of those things where these are the tough decisions that I think we just have to fight, you know, and move forward. I mean, we just gotta figure it out. Phasing is not feasible, trust me, when I got the first numbers, I know Mike Herdinger, the consultants, there's gotta be a way that we can phase this, is there something we can do? I just don't see a way around it. I don't see a way that we don't do the whole plant completely at this time. If we could, I would do it. I would make the argument that we could do steps. I don't think any of the steps work if we don't do the complete project. So at the end of the day, we have to figure out how we meet the consent order. So the action plan that staff is proposing. That the plan that you guys got on Friday had been updated, and if you remember, there was a memo kind of in the front that said some of the updates since the public hearing had happened. They're pretty minor, they're more typos and things like that, but the big change is that we're requesting the 21.7 instead of 20 that was in the draft plan of the public hearing. So we want to do the full request of what we need. The second item is we need to address the pending consent order tasks. There's some consent order tasks on there that we just need to check off. And one, they're also going to give us better information about whether we need the equalization that we're proposing. So it would be a full evaluation of the system. We want to make sure that we get the stuff in our system that we have control of right. That if there's manholes that are infiltrating, if there's certain areas of the system that we know have challenges, that we fix those, so that if there's anything we can control that would reduce that equalization, we get it knocked out. So we're proposing that we would hire a consultant to help us with that, and that we're gonna recommend to you that we delay some of the other capital and water in order to make that happen, because we think it's that important. We're also gonna move up the rate study and determine the rate structure as quickly as possible. So the goal is, now we have some numbers, we have some more information, we know where we came in with federal funding, and we think we can get some good numbers on how you guys can start discussing the rate structure. Do you do a ready to serve? Do you not? How do you break that up? We will begin negotiations for an extension of the consent order with Eagle. They're gonna wanna see that we have a plan moving forward and that we're checking off the things that we need to do. And so that we can start working on an amendment to that plan, knowing that we're gonna construct a plan to meet the requirements. The other part is developing a plan to fix the city-owned problems. So if we identify manholes or certain areas, it may be too expensive for us to fix right away. But once we identify it, we need to incorporate it into the capital improvement plan and give a real strategy of how we're moving forward with that. And then the final item, which honestly is the big reason we're at this much flow, is our challenges with private property owners. And these are not easy fixes, as I'm learning, as I talk more and more to people that have examples. The reality is it's just really challenging. And a lot of our homes, there's not a lot of options to fix it. So what's happening is there's sump pumps, their drain tiles, their footings are all connected to the wastewater or to the sanitary sewer, which, so when we see a big rain event, it's without fail. You'll talk to our staff and they'll say it's a couple hours after we've had a big rain and all of a sudden it's like the plant goes crazy, and it happens like in a blink of an eye. And it's because all of those are happening at the same time. And we're seeing that. That is not a problem you fix in 5 years. That's not a problem you fix in 10 years. That's probably not a problem you fix in 20 years. It's a systematic, how do we approach that? And it's not going to be easy decisions for council, because we got to figure out, do we do a point of sale fix of that property? Some of those are really expensive. Do we seek some state funding to do a revolving loan fund for property owners? Do we charge a fee for those that are connected and can't unconnect? What do we do? Well, how do we address this issue? It's got to be a holistic process, because we're only missing time by not approaching it, but these are not easy decisions. There's a lot of examples of what other communities have done, but there's nothing that's fast or quick, you know, as far as getting it taken care of in a way that we could get it taken care of, so we didn't need to do the plant the way that we need to do it. So there's a lot in front of you. And I know we've been talking internally, probably daily, for about the last couple of weeks. And I know you're seeing it for the first time, so I understand that you're gonna have questions or reactions. So we wanna get those questions so that you're prepared next Monday if you need more information.
Okay. $2 million equalization tank costs $5 million. I don't imagine it would cost another 5 million to make it a $4 million equalization tank. Am I right about that? Because once you build the tank, the size of it doesn't necessarily go, adding more space is cheaper, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So is there any harm in making a bigger tank than, see what I'm saying?
Like,
know you-
can this plant facilitate future
Yeah,
growth
well,
easily?
That's one thing I'm worried about. The other is the fact that we're pumping up to that. Because we've had a pump station recently that's gone bad,
Sure.
and so is there general maintenance and stuff that's is that easy to take care of?
Yeah,
It's not a
and,
problem?
and remember, everything would be branded. I mean, I think that's a huge piece of it. Plus the plan would be to automate it so that you're not in there pushing buttons when it'll be based on flow metering. And answer your first question, though, the cost would not be, it's not double. But I think what our thought is with regard to this is that we think the number we have in here is very conservative. But that's the best information we have right now. Our hope is, and I say it's our hope, but I feel pretty confident that we can reduce this to some level because it's not needed. Because we want to get you down to what meets the standard. So I hope that answers your.
And then my final question is, my sump pump and drain field pump to a little hole that goes in my front yard. That's proper, correct?
Depends where that's connected to.
It just goes out into the yard
Oh, yeah, then that's fine.
and that, okay. So knowing that, can you give me an example of something that's, because I know it's proper, what's not proper? They're connected directly into the sewer?
Right into the sanitary sewer,
And why? Because they're old enough so
because
that,
there's nowhere else to put it.
They
Or
didn't treat the water.
the footing tile, my house, the footing tiles were connected directly to the sanitary sewer, because when it was built, that's the way they did it. Didn't even have a sump.
that's.
Now it has all of that stuff, but
But can you give an example of what that would cost a homeowner to fix?
now?
Yeah.
Well,
I mean,
completely.
this is what the challenge
Completely
is.
depends on the house. My house was pretty easy because the basement was pretty wide open, and it was 20 years ago, and it was $7,000 then. I'm guessing it's pushing 20 now.
My neighbor did it 2 years ago, $16,000.
So that's when I say it's not a quick solution. It's not enough to just say, hey, you have to do this within a certain time period. Our residents.
Well, and all that 16,000 or 20,000 does is disconnect the footing tiles. You still gotta have somewhere to pump the stormwater. And in my case, where my house is, I can pump it. I buried some tiles and I have a creek in the backyard.
Right.
A lot of places don't have that. If they pump it out on the ground, it's gonna flow to their neighbor. It's gonna, so we don't have storm drain leads like we have sanitary sewer leads to houses.
Right.
Unless people have asked for them, there are some. So the challenge, that's really the primary challenge. I think there are some that can disconnect. But I think there's gonna be a lot of them that, okay, city, what do I do with my water?
Okay, thanks.
And get out of the basement.
That's very helpful.
So I think when we get to that point of really putting together a strategy, we'd be identifying what are some, so for example, the easiest thing is to fix the things in our system that we have control over. So that's why we're starting with that. The next step is, where are the homeowners where there's an easy connection? How can we help them facilitate that? And then we start running into the ones that are really challenging, and those are not gonna be easy fixes. And so is at that point, do you say, okay, you can keep the current system for a fee? You are costing the system more by doing that. Is there a fee associated with it? Those are all things that would be a much broader discussion, but just, it's not as straightforward as saying just disconnect,
What I love about this plan is that it goes to, I think, what is it, 2045 with our estimated population growth. When I look at our old wastewater treatment plant and the year it was built and what our acute population was back then, and then I look at the different upgrades. And I went back and looked at the census and what our growth was then. What happens after 20 years with this water plant? If, I'm assuming we will continue to grow, how much more easier, will this new plant be easier to do add-ons, repairs, change outs? So that, or are we assuming we have to redo this in 30 years
So I
again?
think there's some things that actually are really timely. I was just actually talking to Elizabeth about this, is that, you know, as we go through the master plan and we're digging a lot of data up about growth and things like that, the majority of Mason is landlocked by farm preservation. And so we're already restricted on a lot of the growth that we can do with outside of our jurisdiction. And I do think it starts to beg the question, which I hope we talk about in the master plan of, when do you do a 425 for utilities? Because maybe you don't, because there isn't as much flexibility. This is a tight spot. This is a tight area to have a plant. And it does mean that, you know, I think we have some growth built in there and we feel comfortable with the growth that's built in there. And when you start to look around at the vacant land, yes, we have vacant land, but how it would be used from a density perspective, I think is pretty limited. And so you gotta balance that. And do you build a plant now for tons of growth when that's just not really how the land is being developed? So, I mean, those are questions that, I mean, if you had concerns about that, I think the question I would be pushing is, do you build the oxidation ditch with more capacity?
Right.
That would be the direction you would go.
I just don't want to repeat. I want to learn from this wastewater treatment plant and lack of growth or trends we're keeping up with. So that, you know, this isn't a struggle for another council in 3 decades.
Well, it's almost impossible to avoid. I mean, this plant's gonna wear out just like the current one has. And we've gotten probably 20 years of excess use out of this plant at a pretty low cost, because we've taken pretty good care of it and actually fixed certain things at certain times when we needed to. The problem is now that the physical infrastructure, the supporting infrastructure, the stuff that's holding things up and together, that's the part that's failing now, and that's really, really hard to fix. So, I mean, there's no way to completely set something up so that they don't, you know, somebody doesn't have to deal with the problem. Now, maybe we can plan better, start, you know, but it's really hard to do that. But I think we got to focus more on getting fixed today and then worry about what we're gonna do 20, 30 years from now, because we've been talking about expanding this plant for 25 years-ish. So again, it's time to get it done. And we gotta do this, we gotta approve a plan to do that.
Are there other questions?
I have a
that-
question on page 2 of 5, I guess, under the soils. Just, I'm not being in the business, it says as part of the final design process, soil borings will be taken near the proposed work areas to determine if any special construction methods are needed. So if you take those soil borings and special construction methods are gonna be needed, isn't that gonna raise the cost?
I mean, that's always a potential, but I think we've been relatively conservative to be able to. And you already have a facility out there that's sat on that site for a long time. So I think you can, with some confidence, I think you can say that you should be able to do a lot of the similar construction that was done previously.
So, and also in the timeline, I guess as I was looking at that, the design's not completed. Have we paid for the design, or is that,
No.
okay, so that's gonna be an additional cost, is that figured
No,
in here?
no, the design you awarded in February. This part of their design contract included them putting together the project plan for this funding. So the design has already been awarded, and they will be continuing with that process during the next, you know, really digging into it deep in the next 9 months, really
Yeah,
covering.
The 7.2 million. The engineering, legal, and contingencies.
Well,
It's in that number.
it's in that,
It's
that's
in
not
that-
all
It's part of
encompassing,
that
yeah,
number.
yes.
It's probably the biggest part of that number.
Our design contract's about $800,000.
Yeah. So that is,
It's not even close to the biggest part.
no, I think that's more of during construction.
Well, but the big part of that number is contingency.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the contingency we figure at this, I mean, the huge piece of that is just the unknown aspect of what construction is gonna happen. So I think that's in the 20% is a contingency amount. And then there's, you know, engineering, construction, engineering, legal. So
But I
that's
want to
about
be
another
clear that
50%.
that cost is related to during construction. This, we've already awarded a contract prior to
So that's
that.
all we're taking, it's not,
That's not in this,
That's already happened. That's not part of these costs. The costs that we're going to the state for are future costs that include the actual engineering costs of when the plant is constructed.
so we have 2 contracts with Hubble?
We only have a contract right now for the design, but we have already talked about
But
whether
this-
we would extend that into the
So
construction
the design
portion.
doesn't include engineering?
No, it does.
No, it's, so we look at it as 2 phases. There's the
Okay.
design phase and then there's a construction phase.
And so this is the engineering during the construction phase?
Yes.
Okay.
but we're still gonna pony up, what'd you say, 200 to 400,000 for the solid study?
No, it's not for the solid study. That is for
The
the,
rate started?
no. The evaluation of the INI and actually the swim model that's required of the consent order. That needs to be done separately because my understanding is that stuff that you would subcontract out for anyway. So we would be directly contracting for that.
That's an analysis of our current sanitary sewer system, including the piping and manholes. And
So they'll be going to every manhole, doing visual checks, all of those things, which we do have concerns that there are parts of the system that you just don't see unless
I
they're
would
fully
thought we'd have done
inspected.
that before now.
We've done partial and in places where we thought there were concerns, but this would be a holistic approach to ensure that we're going out to the residents and saying, we've addressed everything in system. And that is something that Eagle will want as well as part of the consent order.
So if something jumps up in that,
It
then that's
may
gonna be an
reduce,
additional cost.
well, there,
If we
well,
find, if we do that study and we find additional
yeah, when
problems
you
in the
look
system.
here, this development capital plan to fix any city-owned cost. So if we identify anything in that plan, we're gonna have to include it in the CIP to fix. Just like we did Gaston, if you remember that, we found an issue of infiltration at Gaston that we ended up putting in the CIP to fix. And so that's what we would be doing, as we identify those. That doesn't mean we fix them all right away, but we would be putting in a plan to do that.
And remember, this can offset your equalization basin too. So maybe you don't spend as much money on your equalization basin because you find, you know, 3 INI issues that you can repair pretty relatively easily. So it's almost an offset, and ultimately, I think you could potentially fix some of your easy INI problems with a lot less money than you're gonna spend to build storage. And you'll get way more value out of it, because remember, you won't be treating all that water that's now gonna run to your plant and go into your plant, and doesn't matter, whenever it rains, you're gonna keep treating it. So I think this is a very good approach, and a lot of communities do something very similar to what's being proposed here.
And I want to be clear, since I've been here, we've had some money in the budget for INI always. But it's really been, hey, there's an issue, we want some money to make sure we can fix it. Or, hey, we've identified this potential problem, we want some money to fix it, but it's not a lot, and it's not been a holistic approach of the whole system.
I had a question about the headworks equalization. Now, the total capacity of this new plant will be with 6,
MGD.
and we already have headworks pumps that will handle the 6,
Yes.
Correct.
but we're gonna put in another 6. We're putting in, it says, the new EQ pump station will be also 6 million.
Yes.
So we're gonna be running one and the other one's a backup? Or just to be run in those cases where we have, so once or twice every 10 years or whatever the hell it is, we're
Well, it's once
gonna
or twice a year right now, is what we're experiencing.
the backup pumps are gonna pump stuff to the
be.
equalization.
Well, I understand, but do we need,
Right now, we
do we
are,
need?
right
do we
now
need
we're
the-
bringing
the
in
same
pumps.
capacity, the same capacity? Are we doubling capacity in those events?
The calculation on the chart that he showed us is that our 24-hour, 25-year rain event peaks at almost 14 million gallons a day. So we have to be able to handle or demonstrate to the DEQ that we can handle flow in that range. I did notice in the plan, though, you're only referencing 12. It's only referencing the the incoming flow peak will be 12 in the 25-year
Yeah,
storm event.
we think we start very conservative, and we're continuing to back that.
But either way, it's gonna be way more than 6.
It's, yeah,
And so we've gotta have some place to, basically like a retention pond for sewer, raw sewer, to then bring it back to the plant when the plant's not at full capacity.
And you gotta remember, during events now, we're bringing in extra pumps from other communities.
Yeah.
That's what's happening now. And so this would be pumps that would be there to do the equalization, so we could demonstrate it without bypassing.
yeah, you guys have basically all hands on deck when you know rain's coming. And in this situation, you really wouldn't have to do that because it would be automated. So when a certain level of flow got into the plant, then it would pump into the storage tank, and then when the plant flow went down, then it would bring the flow back.
Okay, well, we can talk about next week. We're gonna go over it again.
It is a lot. I was like, I wonder if Deb's gonna be nervous, because I always talk about, I need more than a week for big decisions. And I'm like,
We're giving you 10 days.
we got 10, thank you, Deb.
I want to add one thing
Yeah.
too, that I think the one thing I would add is, doing this work, doing this plan, adopting this plan, doesn't mean you have to do anything. It's just, as she said, it's just keeping you in line for the plan.
I like the amendment, that makes me feel safe. I love the LDFA revision, so.
I mean, I
that's
can't
that's really-
emphasize how
That's really
important-
good.
Yeah, I can't
So-
emphasize how important the LDFA is to this discussion.
Cut a third off the cost
Yeah,
to the property.
And the reality is, by the time we actually move forward, it probably will be a greater contribution upfront to the project, by the time we actually start a payment. And so, if without that contribution, we would be really struggling. And I know there's a lot of communities that are struggling
Mhm.
right now with their improvements that they need to make.
your
Quick
LDFA,
question
right,
on
Russ?
LDFA funding. If they can afford to give $500,000 a year for the next 20 years, what are they doing with $500,000 now?
They've been spending it, they paid for the headworks, they paid for.
No, I'm
the-
talking,
No, I'm telling you, they paid for the study, they paid for the design work, they paid for everything related to the plant. That's their last project. So as soon as the plant is done, as soon as the loan is done, they will be done. So the LDFA has been only doing things related to the wastewater treatment plant since I've been here. We've done headworks, we've done design, we've done the feasibility study, they've paid for everything. None of that has come out of water and sewer. I mean, it's ultimately done by a contribution, but
so that fund was set up to do this, and once this is
Well,
built,
it was-
goes away,
it was set up to do quite a few things, but this is the last project.
will it go away when the pump, when the bill paid?
Well, it's 20 years from now, so I'm not sure, but the reality is that an LDFA, just so you know, from a TIF district perspective, once we have an outstanding loan where there's commitment of funding, then the LDFA, at least in the current legislation, you can't opt out. No jurisdiction can opt out once there is a financing mechanism in place that counts on that revenue. And so it's to our benefit to get them committed now to be contributing to that long term.
So also money from the LDFA has been being saved.
Yeah.
That's how we have almost $3 million anticipated to pay upfront, along with the 3.5 from the federal government. And then every year after that, we anticipate 500,000 minimum from the LDFA that would go towards the payments of the loans or bonds or whatever we use to finance this.
Your
Yeah.
liaison, right, your LDFA?
And the LDFA has been around since '89-ish, I think. They had several things in their plan. They bought us our first ladder truck for the fire department. They paid for a whole ton of infrastructure upgrades on the south side of town. That captured money there, paid for a whole bunch of stuff. One of the things that's in the plan is the expansion of the wastewater treatment plant. It's the only thing left in the plan that hasn't been done. So every nickel from the LDFA, other than paying the expenses of an LDFA to exist, which is very little, is dedicated to this project.
The only other project that they have in there is
Debt they might be.
the non-motorized portion of that, so it has to be in that area. So for those, I want to make sure everyone's familiar, the LDFA is Gestapo, Michigan Packaging, that area. So if there's a project related to the development of that area, that's which is eligible. But this is their last capital project that they are planning to do, or that's in the plan. And the plan has to be adopted by all the jurisdictions, or has to be weighed in by all the jurisdictions. And so the other jurisdictions have committed, so the county is the biggest contributor, has committed to this project. But without them, the numbers would be a lot more scary, for sure.
Well, it's not 40 million. So there's that.
Well, the key thing here is, you're right, and the key thing here is, if we were having this meeting 2 years ago, it would have been 15 million. So, the thing that I think Deb's trying to impress upon us is we have to approve the plan. If it's not this one, which I don't know what else it would be, because we hired them to create the plan, and I haven't seen anything in it other than maybe a few, typos or something that would change that. We just, the whole point of this workshop is that everybody gets a chance to ask any questions they have and get everybody teed up so that when we come to the meeting next Monday, if, come up with more questions, we can ask them. And if we're still not ready to vote on it next Monday, we will be having a special meeting before the end of May, because we will vote on, whether it's approved or not, we're gonna vote on this plan before the end of May. So, we gotta sort it out, we gotta vet it out right now. If you've got questions on this, anything at all, now's the time to talk about it. And then obviously next week, when we're dealing with it, talking about it.
We had some funding left over from the water treatment plant.
I'm sure that's gone to the water
I don't know. if that-
excess money that's
We
been
had a
spent.
$500,000
Oh.
grant.
That was put towards another project, because it came in after the water plant was done. I know what you're talking about. So we got the federal funding, but it came after the project was
Right.
completed. And so we put it towards another thing in the waters,
Okay,
but yes, it's long.
darn. I was hoping to find that little pot.
Yes, yes. Actually, I think that went towards the Headworks project, if I remember correctly, because I remember us having to do reporting on it.
My big concern, this looks good. I mean, we've been planning this for 5 years. I just want to make sure in preparation for next week's special meeting for our public meeting, that we're preparing to answer the public's questions in the most transparent way. How this will affect maybe our senior citizens, like you're so good at making scenarios and questions, Deb. And maybe that will also help with public comment at that meeting. I just really want to make sure that we're communicating very well with this change and how this affects them.
We can do a, similar to what we did with the stoplight, we can do some kind of FAQ or explanation, and also provide some summary, because the public hearing, which I'm not sure how many people, it was on our Facebook page about the increase and things like that, and we didn't get any comments, or we didn't get any even reaction to it. But we want to be clear of that the number that we average per resident has changed, it has reduced, and so why it has reduced and what. And it's really driven by the LDFA. And that is one of those things where we want to be conservative, because we have seen communities, we know of one right now, struggling with their TIF capture not coming in where they thought it would come in, and that's not something you want to be relying on. So we want to be conservative. But I think we can say with confidence that that number is a good number for us right now.
Yeah, I don't know if it's best to like, here's what the project cost will charge, for a month. Because it gets wonky when trying to explain rate increase to that number, right? So I think that's where
Well,
the public will get it confused.
I think I would suggest, we don't try to deal with what people are paying. They should know what they're paying on their own water bill. We just tell them what the added cost is gonna be. They can do their own math. I mean, it's gonna be $19 a month, estimated right now. If you're paying 50 a month in water right now, you're gonna be paying almost 70 in the future. If you're only paying 20 now, you're gonna be paying almost 40 in the future if this happens. Because the problem is, we get bogged down in that, we go 1, 4, and 8, and what about the 6 user?
Yep.
What about the 10 user? What about the 2 user? I mean, to me, we need to calculate and give it a good faith estimate of what it's gonna cost each person or each user to do this. And then how that impacts them one way or the other. Each person's different, each user is gonna be different.
Well, it was more on, just so that they understand that that's in addition to their already bill,
Mhm.
and it's not in replacement of, or a separate way we find the number, because there's gonna be that intersection of confusion. I just
Well-
know that.
Will we be,
Well, I was just
I'm
gonna
sorry.
say, this is, unlike some of the other costs, this is one that's really straightforward. And
Mhm,
saying,
yeah.
this is the amount of the debt payment that we're expecting, this is how much it would be for each additional user. It's not getting into some of the, like you said, fuzzy stuff of, well,
Yeah.
this year we need to raise it because it's capital, no, this is the debt. for
If I
20
took
years.
5 showers in the summer,
It doesn't matter,
yeah,
you're paying
Yeah.
1854 more a month.
are we going to, for the public hearing then, update this plan to talk about the 21.7
It already has been updated.
and the 18.18?
It already-
Okay,
It's
so-
it's in there. It's actually on page. Kind of hard to get through it all. If you go to the cost estimates. User costs are on 5-1. Actually 4-6, but if I mark 5-1, you'll see that 1854 for the average user. So we've made those updates. If you look in that memo, it says that's one of the updates we made to go to the 21.7. It's actually 4-6 if you look at that.
So that will simplify things from tonight's meeting, because we will be talking about 3 different
No,
scenarios.
no.
We will be talking about 21.7 million and $18.54 for a residential user.
Correct.
And that's
What I was gonna say
the
is,
key
the
metrics.
public hearing has to, we talk about what the notice said, and then one of the last slides we do, we say everything that's been updated.
So there will be a presentation
I will
by
make it for
you before we do the public hearing,
That's,
or is it part of?
it's part of the public hearing.
Okay.
It's typically how it works, is
Okay.
I'll go through, because Eagle wants to see about 5 or 6 different points. It takes about 15 or 20 minutes to walk through all the stuff. And then whether there's comments or questions at that point.
But you will only focus then on the 20 million and the 2762. And then at the end, you'll say it's been updated to 21.7.
You know what, we'll make it so that it's the better number.
I,
And we can, it
Thank
makes
you.
more sense after I said.
to me,
it.
the very first slide should say, this is what was noticed,
Yeah.
but these are the changes
Sure.
made, and this is what we're gonna talk about.
Yeah.
Because it'll just be a room full of confusion, I think, if
No,
there's
and
anybody.
I'm sure. Yeah, because this is all based on the assumption that people took the report out and read it, and they have all kinds of comments and questions, which 99.9% of them, nobody has.
Well, and quite frankly, even if they haven't, there's no reason to tell people things that's
Nope.
meaningless. The only thing that matters is right now, the best information we have is a $21.7 million net cost to users. And what we calculate the rates would be, or the increase in water usage cost. They're really the only 2 things that matter, and quite frankly, the only one that matters, I think, is the increase in water usage cost. That's, most people are not gonna get too worried about, is it 21.7 or 20.6 or whatever.
What does it mean to me?
Yeah, what's it mean to me? Right now, you're saying it's gonna cost me 1854. So what they can, that they can then do is hold us accountable when this all gets done and we tell them it's 2965, they can go, wait a minute. What happened? You said it was 1854, and then we have to be able to answer that question. It sounds like Mr. Sneaton saying that he thinks it might even be less, because there's a good chance we might take some cost out of this, which would be nice.
Yeah, hope.
But we don't know what the actual cost is gonna be yet anyway, because we don't have a bid that's been.
We don't even have a design.
Exactly. Any other questions?
Jerry has one back.
The 1854 per month retire the debt. Can that be set off for a separate side of the bill so that future rate increases are not based on that 1854 and compounded every year?
Yes.
I think from a staffing perspective, the short answer is yes, but yes, that's the ready to serve model of this is being those costs and that you would approach usage increases different from that.
So that 1854 would be over here, never to go up for the next 20 years.
If you don't base it on usage, that's what's key. You gotta figure out how your structure is gonna be. That's gonna be part of the rate discussion.
Well, 1854 is what you said would retire the debt.
I understand that, but that is a structure of almost that ready to serve debt separation, 1854. If you start wrapping it into all usage, that might fluctuate, that might change. So for a 4-unit user, they might actually pay more than the 1854.
And wouldn't we have to put in inflation?
She's-
Because we can't hold that at
Jerry,
20 years.
Treating 1854 as a fixed cost, which is what this is doing, it's a fixed cost.
That's just
It's the
what I
cost
asked.
of debt, exactly. So what Deb is saying, though, we don't have to calculate the debt payment that way. We can charge the 1-unit user less towards debt than the 4-unit user. That would be basing this as a variable cost, which I think, by the look on your face, you would agree with me, that would be silly. So. focus
We
on
agree.
I
that.
just can't understand because according to the slide that came up, the 1854 is the same for 1 unit, 4 unit, or 8 unit.
Exactly, that makes it a fixed cost, but we don't have to structure it that way.
No, I'm saying, why don't we structure it that way?
Exactly.
And have compounded every year. when we raise the
Exactly,
water
and,
rate.
and the other thing I was gonna point out is every year, every time we do rate increases, we don't do one rate increase.
Yeah.
We increase every line that we want to increase. We'll increase the meter charge, we'll increase the capital improvement charge, we'll increase the usage. So this will be a different line item in the bill, and we will know if we're increasing it, and there's no reason to increase it if it's treated as by this model, where you just take the number of users. You do have to, don't you have to do some normalization, because we're doing it based on connection on meter size, right? RU,
So if you look at here, the commercials are at a higher rate.
yeah, so a 1-inch residential meter is a 5/8 meter, I think, and then 1 inch is for commercial, 2 inches, so they pay more,
Is that based on ready to serve?
yes.
It's a ready to serve structure. It's a ready to serve structure.
So you're saying right now that you're assuming that we're gonna go for a ready to serve?
I'm not saying anything. All I-
That's a separate meeting where we would have to discuss.
That's what I'm trying to describe to you, Jerry.
Factor stuff in.
Treating this debt as a fixed cost, get rid of ready to serve. Just treat it as a fixed cost that we pay as a fixed cost based on meter size. So we would charge someone with a 1-inch meter more of the fixed cost, but it would be the same for all 1-inch meters, it'd be the same for all 5/8 meters. It wouldn't vary by how much water they actually use, only by the size of their meter.
Well, I guess I'm not smart enough to quite understand. I see 1854 up there for all 3 classes.
Those are all residential 5/8
I
meters.
understand that.
Same meter.
The next page is a commercial 1-inch meter, a commercial 2-inch meter, and a commercial 4-inch.
So what you're saying is we're gonna go ready to serve for commercial?
No one's going there yet. We're, in the future, we will have.
I don't know why you're hung up on ready to serve.
We'll discuss.
We're not even talking about that. We're talking about a fixed cost to
We
pay off
wanna
a
go
debt.
there.
It's just.
But
a
it's
debt.
not a fixed cost. As you just said in the commercial side, it's based on
It's a
meter
fixed,
size and it could go up or down.
no, I started by saying it's based on REUs, which is a way of normalizing meter sizes to get to a common number. And now you are getting complicated with sewer stuff. And if we need to get that broken down that much so that everybody understands how we went from 18 whatever to 2837 on a 1-inch meter, then maybe we need to have that data so people can
It's
see.
based on how many of those meters we have and we're
Yep.
separating. It's all based on equalization of the structure of meters.
Yep.
And so this is just one way to approach it, but we wanted to give you an idea of what that might look like. But all of that would be a discussion that would be part of the rate study recommendation.
Right.
You're not making any of those decisions today, but I think everybody kind of wanted to know, what does this mean to the average user?
I mean, theoretically, we could make it 0 for residential users
could.
and make commercial users pay for it all.
Which
Well, a rate study, it's ready to serve. Across the board, turns that around, it makes it more easier for commercial building, or puts a load on the residential rather than on the commercial.
not always. Not in most
If you
cases.
go across the board.
You have to justify
You
that
can do
that's
it however
a,
you want.
yeah,
It'll be cool once we get the rate study to explore all of that.
Jerry,
I think it's good
The-
ideas, Jerry.
yeah, this is a fixed cost model, which is similar to a ready to serve model. And the residentials, most of the residentials are paying much less percentage wise than the commercials. I mean, most residentials are the 4 and up, not the 1.
Right.
So they're at 26% or less, and these guys are 39 and. So, I mean, this model is not giving any benefit to the commercial. But that would be good number, I think, or good information for us to have to understand if it can be done in a way that can be communicated to us without differential equations or calculus, is how the 1854 relates to a 1-inch meter, because I know it's clear that you're not just doubling it. So,
When we get there, since we're talking about it, could you add what it would look like if all commercial paid for it, just for funsies?
I don't think I'm gonna put that in a public document.
I only said that to point out, we have total latitude to figure out how we structure this.
A latitude that you still have to justify legally is an appropriate distribution of the costs.
I agree, yes, I understand.
Well, I would point out, if we go to a ready to serve, we have more fixed costs than just that
Absolutely,
Correct.
to pay off.
absolutely.
So we ought to add those into whatever the ready to serve.
Well, when we get to the rate study and we pick a rate structure,
Then,
we will.
okay, yeah. I knew
That's 4 months away.
I knew I was throwing a curveball before I should have.
But it does show the challenges if you just use usage. It does show the challenges when we do have fixed costs. And so that's the part that we're trying to just give you a taste of what we might be talking about, but I knew this would be a challenge without the full rate study done. But I also think you want to know, and Eagle requires us to indicate what we think the impact to a residential user will be.
Yeah, that's probably one of the biggest pieces of the project plan.
They don't require you to give any indication of the impact to commercial stuff or larger meters?
They don't care about that.
Why do they care about the residential? They're the ones making us do this.
There you go.
That's what I'm saying.
Well, that could be. Well, if other questions come up, let us know, but also we do have the option, like we said, of a special meeting if you don't feel like you have enough information. There'll be a presentation, public hearing, and then we will have on the agenda action on it. And you guys can determine whether you're ready to do that or not. Any other?
Anything else? Anyone? Oh, Deb lied for 6:22.
I feel like that wasn't my fault.
You called this meeting. So I guess we're adjourned.
Good meeting.